Thanks for passing the torch over to me, Sarah. I'm sure, to start off here, I'm sure that we all have a big question in the back of our minds. What's going on with water, and will the drought ever end? What is our future here? Today we have Secretary Wade Crowfoot, Secretary of the California Natural Resources Agency, giving an update on what to expect for this year's growing season. Wade Crowfoot became California Natural Resources Secretary in January 2019, appointed by Governor Gavin Newsom. He oversees an agency of 21,000 employees who protect and manage California's natural environment. This includes stewarding the state's forests and natural lands, rivers and waterways, and coast and ocean, and protecting fish and wildlife, and overseeing the energy development. Yep.
Oh, great.
Come on up.
Stop drinking the coffee. Well, thanks so much. Good to be with you all, and great to be here in person this year. Again, I'm Wade Crowfoot, and I lead one of our environmental agencies at the state. And for those of you who track the federal government, our sister agency, California Environmental Protection Agency, is like the US EPA, more of a regulator. And our agency, Natural Resources, is a little more like the Department of Interior. And then, of course, we have our third key agency on all things water and drought, and that is our Department of Food and Agriculture, which is like USDA. So I want to share thoughts on where we find ourselves with drought and with water in California and across the American West. And I'll share something that you already know, which is we are facing a worsening regional drought across most of the American West that's really unprecedented in nature. I spent the first half an hour of my day with Dave's staff at Western Growers talking about the Colorado River Basin. The Colorado River Basin provides water to 7 states and 2 countries. It's experiencing a drought or water shortage for over 20 years. Apparently, this is the driest 22-year period on record, and possibly in 1,200 years. We are facing a situation on the Colorado that many of you know, where if we experience middling precipitation over the next couple of winters, we could hit dead pool in our 2 largest reservoirs on the lower Colorado, and that is Lake Mead and Lake Powell. Dead pool meaning we wouldn't be able to export any water to the southwest, which would, of course, be catastrophic. So this is an unprecedented challenge in the Colorado River Basin. Go further to the north, the 2 major river systems that we depend on for a lot of our water in California, the Sacramento River System and the San Joaquin River System, are in a very bad way. Last winter, Lake Oroville, which is our largest state-managed reservoir, experienced about 25% of the inflow into that reservoir that we expected. Lake Shasta, of course, the federally operated reservoir, our largest reservoir in the state, had a horrible winter for precipitation, and we're facing what may be the largest amount of fallowing in the Sacramento River Valley ever. So we all know in California and the West, drought is something that happens periodically, as well as flood. But I'll argue that these conditions are unprecedented. We are in uncharted waters. What science is telling us is that the hotter temperatures in the winter, even if it's a few average degrees warmer in the winter, means more of that winter precipitation is falling as rain and not snow. And that's, of course, a big problem in the Colorado River Basin and in California, where we depend on that snowpack in the Rockies, in the Sierra Nevada, for our water supply. And frankly, we built a water delivery system and a water supply system anticipating that slow melt of snow in the spring and summer. So you have less snowpack to rely on as a result of these hotter temperatures. And then in the spring and summer, temperatures are warmer. So more of that snowpack that we anticipate would go into the reservoirs is absorbing into very dry ground or evaporating into warm air. So as I said, last year, Lake Oroville, our Department of Water Resources, based on a 100-year hydrograph or 100 years of record keeping, maintained the pretty good understanding of, based on how much snow you have, how much water comes into the reservoir for use. And what we experienced was about 25% of what was anticipated as a result of these changing temperature conditions. And we're hearing from our colleagues who do a lot of work in the Rocky Mountains on the Colorado River system the same thing. So we are experiencing conditions we've never faced before, and in the third year of a worsening drought, just a couple of years after the worst drought in modern history. So there's a lot of things that we need to focus on to maintain agricultural prosperity, economic prosperity, and of course, our way of life in California and the West. And I'll say there's really two major thrusts of the work that we need to engage in. First is we need to modernize our infrastructure and our management to deal with this new normal. What I mean by that is we have a system that was built over 100 years in California, 1,500 reservoirs, some remarkable engineering feats that move water far distances in California, and that served us really well. And in fact, we grew into a state of 40 million people, the 5th largest economy in the world, as a result of that water system. But that water system is outmoded for the challenges that we face. It's 20th century infrastructure for a 21st century challenge. So likewise, I would say we have to modernize our management as well, based on the fact that while our management worked well in the 20th century, we are facing new challenges. So what it means for our leaders in agriculture is, in part, continuing to do what you've already been doing. From my perspective, number one, become as efficient as possible using the water that you have. Remarkable statistics around the reduced water usage for increased agricultural yield in recent decades. Our state is committed to continuing to invest in agricultural water efficiency, more pop for the drop, so that our agriculture sector can continue to maintain prosperity across California and the West, but if in a situation with less reliable water. Likewise, we're also investing in what we call a healthy soils program. My colleague, Agriculture Secretary Karen Ross, will probably hit on this later today. The idea is subsidizing those farmers on a voluntary basis that want to amend their soil with more organic content. The benefit there being more water retention into the soil and more sequestration or removal of carbon pollution from the atmosphere. So number one is how can we work together to continue to improve the efficiency of the water that does get used by agriculture in California. Number two is storage. I'll say it. We need to update and expand our storage where appropriate to capture what will be more and more large storms coming off the Pacific Ocean in the wintertime, these so-called atmospheric rivers. How can we actually update our storage system to capture that precipitation that's coming increasingly in flashy storms, and then storing it for periods like we're experiencing right now? One clear no-brainer, in my opinion, is to significantly augment our storage of water underground. We know across our state, across the West, a lot of our underground aquifers are depleted. We've relied on those aquifers, and frankly, we've over-relied on those aquifers in recent decades. And there is tens of millions of acre-feet of storage in these aquifers if we can get water below ground. So one thing we're focused on in the state is how can we make it easier to recharge groundwater basins in the wintertime? We're investing, we're providing grants for water agencies, particularly groundwater management agencies, to build the infrastructure to get that water underground. And we're trying to simplify the process of allowing these projects to take place while protecting the water rights of water users downstream from those projects. Storage also means, of course, above ground storage. Now, as I mentioned, we have 1,500 reservoirs in the state, and most of the most effective locations for reservoirs and dams have already been taken. But we know there are smart locations to put above ground storage, particularly in certain regions that are managed by regional water agencies. If you look at urban Southern California, since the drought in the late 70s, they made a concerted effort to invest in more regional surface storage, and as a result are much more resilient to drought than they have been in the past. We know that projects like Sites Reservoir can be a really important part of our solution moving forward to capture that water off the Sacramento River in big, wet winters for use during dry periods like that we're experiencing right now. So efficiency, diversified storage, conveyance. we have to update our conveyance system to actually be able to move this water and to recharge our groundwater basins. We know that some of our regional infrastructure, whether it's the Bryant-Kern Canal or the Delta-Mendota Canal, need help. They have been impacted severely by subsidence or ground sinking due to that groundwater depletion. And so the state and the federal agencies are working with those local irrigation districts to actually reinvest, modernize, and rehabilitate that regional conveyance. We continue to need modernized conveyance through the Bay Delta. We know that much of our water flows off the Sierra Nevada into the Sacramento and San Joaquin systems and through the Bay Delta. And we know the Bay Delta is a very vulnerable bottleneck. Right now, it's difficult to export water from the Bay Delta in certain times of the year because we're trying to prevent fish and wildlife from becoming extinct. We also know that climate change is going to increase the sea levels and increase saltwater intrusion into the interior Bay Delta, where right now that fresh water flows through for export. And that water is increasingly vulnerable in coming decades, not to mention vulnerability of an earthquake. You may know that the most catastrophic emergency that I worry about, that wakes me up in the middle of the night, is losing levees in the Bay Delta that support our water conveyance system. Overnight, 25 million Californians could lose their access to fresh water, not for days or weeks, but months. And I would argue we have never experienced an emergency like that before in California. So conveyance is absolutely critical. Now, I'm obviously speaking to you all in the agricultural sector, but there's a lot more investment and modernization that needs to happen in our cities and our towns, including more water recycling, potential desalination where it makes sense, stormwater capture in the urban context. So recognizing this new normal, these are all of this investment, this modernization we need to do on our infrastructure and management. But look, we're in the middle of the drought. We also need to stretch our water supplies. Because while that pivot to the new normal and preparing and adapting to the new normal will take time, we don't know when this drought's going to end. So I've been spending my time traveling around Southern California, particularly in our cities and towns, exhorting our communities to reduce their water usage, eliminate water waste, expand water conservation, to stretch our water supplies. Over the last year, we've asked for that on a voluntary basis, and we've experienced mixed results. We're seeing a modest reduction overall in the last year of about 3% reduction since the year prior. Some portions of the state are doing remarkably, increasing or reducing their water use by 15-20%, and others aren't. We're seeing some good news in May and early June numbers where that water conservation is accelerating, and we'll need to see it. And the governor has been clear that if we don't see it, we'll need to consider other options to try to stretch these water supplies because it's that serious. Now, you all know in agriculture that it's serious because depending on the seniority of your water rights, there are a lot of agricultural producers that have had to fallow and are having to make tough decisions based on curtailments from our state regulator, the Water Board. And so while the water shortages look different in the agricultural sector than they do in our cities and towns, we recognize that there is major impact, perhaps unprecedented impact in parts of the state and our agricultural communities as a result of this drought. And we're trying to help communities and producers, irrigation districts navigate this. Secretary Ross will likely detail some budget investments that the legislature and the governor agreed on just a few blocks away, just a couple of weeks ago, including targeted support for small growers to actually be able to weather the current conditions. But I won't sugarcoat it. These are unprecedented challenges, uncharted waters, and we're working to navigate this all together. I'll end where I started, and then we can sit down and take some questions, and that is the Colorado River Basin. We are focused in California, working with the other lower basin states of Arizona and Nevada to come up with a shared solution to conserve enough water in those reservoirs in Lake Mead and Lake Powell to stabilize the system. Our federal partners, the U.S. Reclamation Commissioner, went before Congress last month, and she said, by August 15th, we need a plan from our states and our water users, a voluntary plan to conserve enough water in those reservoirs to stabilize these systems or these reservoirs and the water and the river system. And if we don't come up with that plan, the federal agencies need to identify their own plan. So I think a lot of what we need to do is work together to essentially control our own destiny and not have others necessarily make decisions for us outside of the region, but to work together to navigate this very difficult time. So thanks so much, and I'd be glad to answer questions that you or others may have.
Is this on? Okay. Well, my first question is, we were talking a lot about drought, and this is year 3 of an extreme drought here, and a very different type of drought as you illustrated. What are we going to do? What's the long-term plan if we have drought for 5 more years?
Well, as I said, we need to work with an urgency we haven't before to modernize our system. So in other words, right now it takes far too long to put in these infrastructure updates and upgrades than what the current conditions demand. In other words, climate change and these change conditions are moving at a rapid pace. I'll say climate change is on the march, and the greater risk is to do nothing than to do something. So one thing we're working on is how to figure out the pathway to get these projects, get these improvements online more quickly. So right now, thanks to our legislature, our governor, we, over the last 2 years, are allocating over $8 billion across the state, and that's to water agencies, irrigation districts, to take specific actions to respond to drought, whether it's getting drinking water to communities that don't have it, or putting in a pipeline where it failed, and then trying to bring on these projects, these supply diversification projects online as quickly as possible. So that $8 billion is an unprecedented amount of money, actually more money than the last general obligation bond, statewide bond in 2014. That being said, we have to help communities use it and turn it into more drought resilience more quickly. And then likewise, we need to stretch water supplies. And, a lot of water agencies are looking at us and saying, look, we're not in a bad position. We've got a couple more years of water. Don't necessarily put us in the same bucket as the folks, the 6 million people in greater LA that may run out of water by the end of the year, according to their regional water agency, if they don't take action. But the point I make is we don't know when the drought's going to end. And what if it's another 5-7 years? Australia experienced a drought 12 years in length. And what would that look like? So our kind of principle is no regrets actions. What can we do right now to ensure that, God forbid, if this drought does go another 5 years, we're going to have water, at the end of that period.
Okay, great, good answer. I'm going to throw a 2-part question at you here. We talked a lot about storage. Are we going to have groundwater recharge projects ready if we actually do get some heavy rains this winter to be able to flood some of these fields and let that percolate down in the aquifers? And the second part is about Sites Reservoir. I know that the governor has tasked you with working closely on the permitting process for that. Can you give us a little update on how that permitting's going? What is the timing looking like for that? Are we able to even streamline something this big?
Great question. So on this question about groundwater recharge, certainly there will be projects in the ground this winter to capture those storm flows, but I'll argue not enough. I'll argue there are far more opportunities to capture groundwater than are currently being realized. And so part of this is getting money, getting resources to these irrigation districts to actually get the infrastructure in, to get water to those spreading basins, to identify where the soils percolate, and to put it all in place. And then the other piece is to adjudicate or to mitigate those water rights issues that downstream water users have, which is really important to folks in the agricultural community, that we're respecting the water rights system, and streamline the process. So our state water board deserves a lot of credit. Department of Water Resources, same, trying to get these projects on more quickly. And from my perspective, the big moonshot should be, increasing our underground water storage by a significant factor, like an exponential factor here in coming years. As I've said, there's more than enough supply underground. It's just a matter of getting the water there. And that's where conveyance comes in. You have to be able to push it through the Bay Delta in the winter and to actually get it underground. As it relates to sites, significant progress is being made on sites. Recently, the federal government stepped up, the Biden administration providing over a $2 billion low-interest loan through US EPA, which is a big shot in the arm to the project. We've been navigating permitting issues, questions within our agency at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. They have statutory obligation to ensure that impacts on fish and wildlife are either limited or mitigated. So I think we're on a pretty good pathway on that front. There's a lot of CEQA work, et cetera, that needs to be done. The next big step is to the State Water Board. And one thing that sites will have to do is address any water rights users' complaints about the impacts of the project on their water rights. And that's a process that typically is a fairly slow process. It's important because our water board has an obligation to protect the water rights of those that already have them. And in a situation like this, those who feel like their water rights are impacted by operation of the project can petition. So we're working with the sites team to try to figure out how do we expedite that process so that the water board can provide a water right for the project. The sites is one of 7 projects that is being funded by a Prop 14 water bond that was passed by California voters. Combined, those 7 projects will deliver more water than 2 Folsom reservoirs. So it's a significant amount of water. 3 above ground storage, 4 underground storage. So I've been meeting with them at the governor's direction over the last month, each of these individually, deep dive meetings to understand what's your timeline, how can state government help you exceed that timeline, what are your risks, how can we limit risk to actually getting these projects online, because that's a significant amount of water.
And you mentioned the Bay Delta a little bit there. Getting back to that with freshwater flows and habitat conservation, you've been also working closely with the Voluntary Agreements process. There was a major announcement a few months ago. Where do we stand with that, and what's next?
Yeah, for those that haven't followed this, let me just say what we're trying to do is break out of this endless cycle of regulation and litigation, where water management is ultimately decided, for example, in a federal court, and then persists for a decade or more. It's a really problematic way to manage our system that's changing so quickly. So we're stepping back and we're trying to create essentially more of a shared approach to managing water for the protection of water quality and fish and wildlife beneficial uses in the Sacramento, San Joaquin, and Bay Delta. Our water board and our colleagues at the water board have a legal obligation to update this water quality plan, and it's very overdue in being updated. They went down the pathway of a regulatory approach, simply an unimpaired flows approach, and then Governor Brown and now Governor Newsom have said, hey, let's step back because this would be that, perpetuate that cycle of litigation. And not only the regulatory approach would require several years to adjudicate water rights, and then you'd have to adjudicate the litigation. You're talking over a decade to improve the river system. So let's come together. Let's bring water users together, urban water agencies, irrigation districts, and identify an approach that works, that actually passes that legal and scientific muster to help the system recover, but do so in a way that doesn't have calamitous impact on communities. So we came up with these voluntary agreements, and they're enforceable agreements, but they're called voluntary because they're bringing everybody together. And as you said, just a few months ago, we announced essentially the agreement on the broad strokes of what that looks like. And what it looks like is more water back into the river, because that's important to meet our obligation, but significantly more restoration of habitat. Interestingly, the water board can regulate flow, but it can't compel more habitat. And we know, just intuitively, that fish, salmon, need not only enough flow, but they need habitat to spawn and to rear. So the voluntary agreement is all about more flows, more habitat, and then what's really important is some shared governance and updated science, and then adaptively managing the system. So that's galvanized a lot of momentum among the state and federal agencies, the water user community. Environmental community, broadly speaking, pretty dubious of that approach at this point. But we're moving forward, and we're not waiting. And so we're turning that term sheet into a legal agreement here in coming weeks, which then gets submitted to the water board. And then the water board does all of this analysis to understand if it's legally and scientifically adequate for their statutory purposes. The good news is we're going to start implementing. We already have a list of priority habitat projects. We're working to cut the red tape on getting those projects done. Governor Newsom, the legislature, put a lot of funding in the budget for those projects. So we're going to show California, we want to show California that we can do it differently and that we can manage our system differently. And I think who's going to benefit when we do this is not only the environment, because of course that's important for a lot of reasons, including the law, but also farmers, also communities that need reliable sources of water and they need certainty. And the worse off our system goes, and if we just rely on a regulatory approach, that certainty erodes. And so with this approach, what we're trying to do is, yes, recover the system and to strengthen the certainty that water users are going to have, that they understand how much water they're going to be allocated moving forward.
Got it. Great question. So let's switch over to some audience questions here. Starting off, kind of getting back to the surface water storage topic. With widespread support and funding for surface water storage expansion, what are the major barriers to action?
Well, I think it's one, which projects and where. And I think we can identify projects that simply make good sense. I've talked about sites. There's the expansion of Los Vaqueros in the deep East Bay, in the Bay Area. That's going to be beneficial to a set of communities that rely on water through the Delta. We're talking about expanding Pacheco Reservoir south of San Jose in a way that potentially interconnects with San Luis, San Luis Reservoir in ways that are going to be beneficial for agriculture. So there are projects that just make sense, and we have to help them come online faster. I think a lot of people get frustrated and they say, 2014, voters passed a water bond and they allocate almost $3 billion for storage. And 8 years on, we still don't have that storage in the ground. And we feel that frustration, and frankly, the governor feels that frustration. Part of the challenge with these, the Proposition 1 funding is the ballot that went before the voters has a very complicated process that's very time-consuming moving forward, and that's something we've had to navigate. It's not an excuse, it's just a reality. But now we're looking at, okay, yes, but given these changing hydrology from climate change, how can we help check all of these boxes more quickly to actually get the projects built? So I think that there is a great ability to cut the red tape or at least streamline those processes to get these projects online.
Okay, great. That wraps up our session then, and thanks so much for cramming so much into 30 minutes there. And thank you for that update.